Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to see you. This is our first session of our speaker series, Social Studies in Sweatpants, which of course is designed for you to be able to come to in sweatpants. So you can log in the comfort of your own home at 7 p.m., hopefully after the day is behind you. So really quickly, just to introduce the Oakland Schools Social Studies consultants before we introduce Heather. I'm Molly Gale. I'm one of the Social Studies consultants. Chris?
I'm Chris. I'm a social studies and teacher induction consultant. I'm wearing my warm, cozy hat because I'm in my home.
My name is Stacy Woodward, and I'm a disciplinary literacy and social studies consultant, and I am in my sweatpants.
I like how we're having confessionals. And if you have lost track of it, I'm just going to pop into the chat. That is the s'more with the registration information for our next two sessions, which are coming up in February and I think April. But the reason we're here tonight is to hear from Heather. So I want to introduce her right now. She is an archives educator, and we are just big fans of hers. Once you've heard her speak once, you are just going to want to be her best friend as well. Her compelling question tonight that she is going to address is, what do historians know about sources that educators miss? She has experience in social studies instruction, in curriculum development and assessment, instructional design, and the use of technology in learning environments. And if you have ever had the chance to talk to her, you will find out very quickly that she is extremely passionate about archives, education, and history, and how they all play together. She is extremely interested in best practice for instructional use of archival collections and disciplinary practices in the K-12 classroom. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Heather.
Hello. So let me get my screen started sharing. Can everybody see that okay? Perfect. So since we're all into confessions, I too am wearing my sweatpants. I did the classic Zoom move, nice shirt, necklace, sweatpants. So I am joining all of you in the sweats. So basically the reason this presentation came about, Stacy and Molly saw a presentation I did for the OER Big History Project. That was about a year ago now. And they asked me to come do this. And so we've kind of been planning it backwards and forwards. And so I'm going to spend some time digging into the ideas that I presented in that session. It was about 10 minutes. I'm going to share the link with it with you at the end, just in case you are like, I just want to hear this again, kind of a quick refresher. It'll be a great way to refresh on that. But I'm also willing to share my slides. So Molly, I think, sent those already or is going to put them in the chat.
I just dropped them into the chat right now.
Perfect. So you have my slides. So don't worry about trying to write down the things that are on the slides that I'm saying. I am going to give you notes in addition to those that you don't have in the slides, but the stuff that's on the slides you have, so you're good to go. So as Molly said, my name is Heather Nice. I am a PhD candidate in interdisciplinary studies. I'm also the director of education at the Lincoln Presidential Library Museum. So as far as how I got here, because that's a question I get a lot, I love history. I love sources. I love the things of the past. And so when I was a kid, and I'm talking like 5 or 6, my grandmother moved next door and she had all this really cool stuff in her house. And I used to go over there and, you know, I'm a child of the 80s. So it was a completely Indiana Jones time period. And I would ask her if I could go on an archaeological exploration in her house, and God love her, she would let me. And so, you know, I would go explore and dig through her drawers, and she would, you know, I would find things. So like one year I found ration stamps from World War II, and I got to sit at the base of her chair, which is currently in my office, kind of a cool synthesis there. And she would tell me the story of my family from World War II and like where the ration stamps came from. And so I have this kind of deep, passionate love of things of the past and the past itself. And so I started off as a history teacher, and one of my department heads, Pierre Larson, who some of you have met, one day I was complaining to her that we knew as teachers sources were good and we should share them with our students. But unfortunately, particularly when teaching world history, they're really hard to find. And this was back in 2006. So they were really hard to find back then. And she looked at me and she said, you should do something about it. I'm like, what can I do about it? Well, fast forward a couple of years and I ended up getting my master's degree in library and information science, specifically in archives education. And so here I am trying to do something about it. So I have 4 objectives for the presentation tonight. First, I want to start with having everybody think about how we define history, because I think that's really important to any conversation about disciplinary practice. And then we're going to talk about how historians really think about disciplinary practice. And then I'm going to give you 5 rules to improve our disciplinary use of sources in the classroom. And then we'll evaluate how using sources more effectively can actually increase inquiry and disciplinary practice in our classrooms. And then at the end, I'll give you a couple more rules or suggestions, I guess, tips is probably better, as to how you can implement the 5 rules in your classroom if you're not really sure where to start. So it seems like a lot. I promise I'm very quick, but if you do have questions or if I'm going too fast, feel free to pop a question in the chat box, interrupt me, grab the mic. I'm very much one of those informal presenters, and I appreciate it when there is conversation. So I'd like to start by throwing a question out there that I'd like you to either, let's put this one in the chat box because I'd like to see it in writing. So if you could do me a favor and first, let's write how your students would define history. Not now when you've had them for 6 months, but on the first day of class. Like, how would your students define history first day of class? And then second, how do you define history? So I'm gonna give you a second to do that. So students and you, what are those definitions of history? Things that are old. Love that. Okay, studying the past, stories told by old people. That's great, Norman. Anything from the past, something old. So seeing a lot of common definitions here, right? Like the past, it's old. I taught high school, so my students' responses would have included the word boring in some capacity. Let's be real. Names and dates, absolutely. So yeah, all of those are great responses. Would anybody like to talk about kind of what they're seeing all these responses or why they think students have these answers? And feel free to grab the mic.
Sometimes students tell me that their parents tell them about history and how it was their least favorite subject and it was boring and so forth and so on.
Yeah, we really did a number on parents, didn't we? I mean, you know, parents, like it's names, it's dates, it's worksheets. In Texas, where I grew up, it's coaches teaching it, right? Like there's all these, like who does history, right? I think that's a great point. So sometimes it's not even the things we say, it's their parents and what they encounter at home. So I wanted to put on the screen a couple quotes from historians. And so this is history according to historians. I'm not going to read it to you, but I'd like you to take a chance to skim it, knowing that there are likely as many definitions of history as there are historians, right? Like we all have slightly different ways we approach our profession. So take a second to read it. And if you would, in the chat box, put the number for the ones that most resonate with you, or if there's some that you disagree with, what those numbers are. So again, numbers are the ones that resonate. Perfect. So 3, 4, and 6 resonates with Molly. And then if you have any that disagree with you or that you disagree with, you can say that too. Anybody else? 4 and 6, 3 and 6. We're seeing a lot of like 3, 4, 6. That's fun. So I really like some of these. You know, obviously Becker and Carr are older definitions of what history is. But if you think about some of these, like if you take Becker, the memory of things said and done, if that's history, aren't we all historians? Right? If the memory of things said and done, we all have memories of the past. We all have memories of what came before us. So what I like about these definitions and why I provided these, and again, it's not an exhaustive list, but I think they all speak to a different part of history. And they're all ones that I think we as individuals and even our students could resonate with, right? Like if this is what history is, if this is what a historian is, I can do that, which I think is important to share with our students. So historiography, which is the study of how we write history, so how history has been recorded, you can spend whole semesters studying that. And if you get a history degree, you probably took at least one historiography course. Certainly, if you did a master's or anything beyond that, you probably did more than one. Obviously, we don't have that kind of time to dig into it, but I thought, since the focus of the presentation is on disciplinary practice and sources are fundamental to disciplinary practice, it was important to highlight a couple concepts from historiography that first frame how historians approach their work, but then second, help us understand the approach they take to sources. So on this next slide, I've come up with what I think are 4 framing statements when we think about historical disciplinary practice. These are themes that I've synthesized from my reading of historiography literature, which I've done exhaustively for my PhD. So specifically those discussing disciplinary practice and how historians define and understand history. I want to be clear, these are not something that every historian could tell you, oh, these are the statements that frame history. Like, it's not that, right? These are just framing statements that I think do a good job of summarizing what the literature says and then kind of helping us think about how historians look at sources. And I do want to be clear, this piece of the presentation is a little more academic in nature, because I think it's important when we're talking about literature from a discipline that we give them the words. So I will give you some quotes from different pieces of literature to kind of validate what I'm saying. If you have questions, feel free to put in the chat. If you disagree with me, feel free to put that in the chat too, because I love a good discussion. So the first framing statement I want to provide is that history is not the past. The past is the series of events that occurred before this time, whether we know about them or not, and the records that the past left behind. It is, as Becker notes, quote, absolute and unchanged, end quote. History, on the other hand, is the interpretation of the past. So it's in a continuous state of flux and discovery. Carr describes it as, quote, a constantly moving process, end quote, an unending dialogue between the past and the present. So you've got a very different feel here. And I think sometimes our students really mistake the past for history. And I think it's our job when we're talking about disciplinary practice to really make clear to them, history is not the past. Right? Because when we talk about evaluating history under new lenses, you get those kids that say the past can't change or history can't change. It's like, well, history can, but the past can't. And so I think that's a really important thing to make clear. The second framing statement is that there is no truth, capital T, only little t truths. So for most of modern historical practice, and I would say the 1800s on, there was really a distinct push to make history scientific. Many early historians argued that their role was that of a scientist seeking hard facts and discoverable capital T truth, right? Although this was perhaps an attempt to bring relevance to their fledgling profession in a time when science was kind of key post-Enlightenment and Reformation and all the scientific revolution in that time period, the notion of that objective and singular capital T truth has really been abandoned by historians, particularly after the postmodern period when new voices, largely female and BIPOC, started entering the profession and began asking questions about the experiences of those who'd previously been deemed unworthy of being included in the historical record. A great example of this, when I was in my undergrad, so it was right around 2000, one of my history professors had us read Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's The Midwife's Tale. When I was in high school, the version of women's history that I got for the US was 100% the woman stayed home and took care of the house. Like, that was the extent of what women did, right? Well, then you read The Midwife's Tale, and it's this rich experience of this woman who's involved in her community. She's an economic actor, and suddenly it's like, wait, women did more. So suddenly you're resonating with this part of history that maybe you hadn't resonated with in the past. And so, there's 2 things I think it's important to be clear on when we think about the big T truth and the little t truths. Because history examines the past of a variety of actors with different backgrounds, beliefs, and experiences, history is not that objective capital T truth, but rather the merging of all those individual little multiple T truths that create kind of the rich web that we think of when we study the past. And then second, historians aren't saying there's nothing that's true. And I think that's something that a lot of people get stumped on, right? Like, historians still seek to document facts via logical interpretations bound by evidence. Like, that's not gone away. However, how they interpret those facts remains open to discussion, debate, argument, and new discovery as new historians ask new questions, new sources are found, etc. So no big T truth, just little T truths. My third framing statement is that history is simultaneously a subversive and democratizing force. And so Hunt describes history as, quote, always liable to erupt, end quote, which I love, right? I love this notion of like history as this revolution, right? And so she says it's always liable to erupt as events and discoveries bring new voices to the forefront. And because of that, Clark and Nye argue that it's simultaneously a subversive and a democratizing force. And so when historians interrogate and confront the work of their peers and, quote, seek out the transgressions, acts of oppression or privileging, and question the construction of facts and the intent of those who purport to know them, end quote, they engage in acts of subversion seeking to overthrow established narratives. Postmodern criticisms of the accepted Western-centric and white male-dominated narratives saw, quote, women and people of color tell white male scholars, your truth is not our truth, end quote, as they subverted the status quo and called for recognition of women's roles and decolonization of historical practice and interpretation. Through their subversion, history expanded. And so because it expanded, because new methods and new historians representing a multitude of individual and communal voices, experiences, and truths start coming to the surface, history and the historians who interpret it start embracing a more global approach while simultaneously working to reestablish agency of individuals who maybe had been deemed unworthy of study in the past. And so as they did that, history is confronting those exclusionary narratives, and it's becoming a democratizing force. So it's both subversive and democratizing at the same time, which, by the way, I love, right? Like, how many of our students would hear history subversive and go, ooh, subversive, that sounds interesting, right? As opposed to the names and dates. I was that kid, by the way, if anybody's curious. Like, I was like, ooh, rebellious, subversion, I'm in. What can we learn more about? And then finally, my last framing statement, history starts with a question. And so what I mean by that is when historians document the past, they begin by crafting a research question that examines a new perspective, an undocumented story, or a new material discovery. They review both primary and secondary sources to better understand what is known already about that question, and then they refine it to make sure they're not repeating somebody's work and they're adding to what we already know. They then seek to do what we call in the archives world, exhausting the archives, which is basically a term that's used to describe an attempt to gain intellectual understanding of the sources that exist related to a particular topic, right? So it'd be like going to the library and checking out all the books related to that subject. They're doing that with archives, except with archives, it usually requires multiple stops because not every archive has everything you need. But anyways, they exhaust the archives and they look at all the books, and then they essentially synthesize those sources to craft an evidence-based argument that responds to that question. So again, history always starts with a question. Like, they don't just go into the past and go, oh, what looks interesting? No, they have a question and then they go look for sources. So I'm going to pause for a second and just give you a chance to kind of share in the chat box, or you can grab the mic. What are you thinking right now? Have you had an aha moment? Do you really disagree with me on something? Do any of these resonate, not hit home? Where are you at? Again, chat box or the mic is fine.
Heather, for me, this kind of framing is really helpful as we think about how to shift into more disciplinary literacy practices with our students. It feels like really accessible entry points for both teachers and students. And it also, I think it just makes it more interesting, right? Like, it's in stark contrast to this idea that it's just like a bunch of things to memorize or whatever. It sounds like, you know, like maybe there's some joy in it and curiosity and fun. So I love that.
Right. And it gives it discovery, right? Like, if it's not a settled upon thing, if we don't agree with, if it's not set in stone, like, wait, I could discover something that nobody knows about the past. Like, I truly can't tell you, when I worked at the National Archives, we actually had kids discover primary sources nobody knew about, and that was their discovery, which is so cool. At Lincoln, if I remember correctly, it was actually, there was a kid that discovered the only known photograph we have of him laying in state in our archive, you know? So like kids can do history, and that's like, I just love it. So in interest of time, I'm going to move on to the 5 rules. So these are my rules. They're nobody else's rules. I came up with them. But I'm framing them in such a way to help you rethink how you teach primary sources. And again, this is synthesis of the literature. If you have questions, I am more than happy to give you my like 10 pages of citations and you can go chase them down. Happy to share. So first, teach your students the nature of sources. So what do I mean by that? What is the nature of sources? So when we think about sources, I'd hazard a guess that most of our students might describe them as old, something from the past, as we saw with the history definitions, right? Sources is kind of in line with that. So historians, unsurprisingly, embrace a far more nuanced description of sources. They know that sources are bound to the time and place of their creation, and they do not by themselves equal facts. The words they contain cannot be taken at face value because context binds their meaning. So instead, when we talk about sources, they need to be interrogated, considering both the social and political context in which they were written, as well as the author's reliability. So as a perfect example for that, I've never forgotten the time in my 11th grade AP US history course, I'm working on a DBQ on slavery, and I encountered this glowing account of slavery. Like the enslaved individuals have free time with their families and they're fed and they're taken care of. And I had such a moment of cognitive dissonance because it didn't agree with anything I'd heard before, right? And I'm stumped until I read the sourcing line that says Charles so-and-so, white plantation owner. And suddenly it was like, oh, he's lying to me, which in 11th grade, I had never encountered a source that was lying, right? Now, of course, as an adult, I understand that he is expressing his truth, which reveals another aspect of sources, right? They're not neutral. Sources are influenced by the beliefs, the perspectives, and the priorities of their author, and sometimes they're influenced by the agenda of external actors. This is true of all the sources we use in our classrooms, by the way, both original records and our textbooks. Because if you've ever taught in Texas, I have, there's a Texas edition version of history. You can't tell me that's not influenced by an external actor, right? So when historians approach sources, they see them as a puzzle, not as capital letters, the answer. And so they use them to seek to verify the information they contain through contextualization, corroboration, never taking them at face value. And so if we want our students to internalize disciplinary practice and to effectively engage sources, we need to make sure they understand the nature of sources first. Because if they look at it and say, oh, this is fact, you've lost them on everything else because they just believe it. They just accept what it says. But how much more fun to teach them? Weinberg's got this great quote. I think it's the British Royal Society's motto, which is nullius und verba, take no one's word for it. So why not teach that to our kids? Like they're skeptical already on their own. Why don't we reinforce that and be like, be skeptical, ask good questions. Again, I was the student that would have been all over that. So what does this look like in practice? So I would say at a most basic level, we need to be careful to not ask students a question and send them to sources on the hunt for facts, right? This happens in DBQs. I mean, I think we've probably all seen it. If you're an elementary teacher, document-based question, but it's basically when you give them a group of sources and send them to find an answer. We need to provide context, what was happening at the time, as well as sourcing information. So the author biography, the name, their positions, their perspectives, to every source that we give them. We also need to teach them to read sources and synthesize themes across what they've read when responding to questions rather than cherry picking for quotes, which again, I think DBQs have put us in some bad habits for that. Not that DBQs are bad. I'm not saying that. I just think we need to be more deliberate and intentional about how we teach students to do them. So those are my basic suggestions. Now, my advanced suggestions, I really think it's important to engage your students in positionality work, because one of the things we've seen happen with historians as a result of postmodernism is when you read historical texts now, they tell you who they are and what their biases are. Like they own it because they know they have it. And so if we engage our students, even at younger ages, who are you? What do you believe? What have your parents taught you about history? all those beliefs and perceptions and cultural truths that they bring into the classroom, they're applying to how they study and understand the past. So if we work them through positionality work and give them a chance to see they're really not neutral and they're really not impartial, then they're going to start seeing those things in the sources as well, right? Because if our students think they're neutral and they're impartial, they're going to think the sources are too. And so if we can embrace them, and it doesn't have to be something that people are going to complain about and your district's going to be up in arms about, depending on where you teach, right? It just needs to be, who are you? What do you believe about the world? And how does this influence how you perceive the past? That's simple, right? And then the second thing I would recommend, and this is a little more nuanced, but I think we really need to embrace a both and approach when we're talking about creators of sources. So as human beings in general, we live in what I would call the gray space, right? None of us are fully one thing or fully another thing. We're always somewhere on the spectrum, right? And historical actors are the same. So I think sometimes we do activities where we say, was this person good or bad? Well, the answer is they're in the middle, right? And I was guilty of that. Like, I say this because I did it. Was Caesar a hero or villain was one of the activities I did in my class. Didn't really lend itself to nuance. And so, think about Jefferson, right? Jefferson is both the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the man who enslaved people. He's both and. Lincoln is both the man who wrote the Emancipation Proclamation and a man who, in his speeches, reflective of his time, but still said, I'm in favor of my race being the supreme one. So he was a white supremacist. So, we can't teach these historical actors as all good or all bad. There's got to be some nuance there, because again, if they see the nuance, they're going to ask better questions. So there's power in that both and approach to the past, because it encourages our students to think beyond those concrete assumptions they might be making. So that's number one, teach your students the nature of sources. Number two, embrace fluidity in defining sources as primary or secondary. So I actually want to start with a question on this one. Take a second. You can either grab the mic or you can throw it in the chat box, but how do you define primary and secondary sources for your students? And it doesn't have to be a paragraph. Just if you had to do it in a couple words, what would it be? Gut reaction. There's really not a right or wrong answer, I promise.
I guess the only way I would explain it to my second graders is primary. I would just say it came from the person.
Okay.
The words came from the person, and then secondary, it's us talking about the person who's at the story.
Perfect. Anybody else?
We talk more about artifacts. So primary artifacts come from that time period in the context, where secondary time has passed, a little bit more reflective, collective information. The person puts the story together with other sources.
Perfect. So those are great answers. And if you look, I think they're really in line with the Library of Congress and the Society of American Archivists, right? These are the people that hold the records, so they're putting out definitions. So primary is those raw materials, the original objects and documents that were created at the time you're studying. And then, of course, firsthand accounts. That's the type of language you see around primary source, right? So secondary are those accounts that retell, analyze, add value via interpretation to what those original records are, right? So all of the definitions you gave are correct, both in the chat box and on the screen, right? Like we've got a pretty good understanding of how to define primary and secondary. So what I'd like you to do is look at this piece of art. Gut reaction, do you think it's primary or secondary? Just put your reaction in the chat. You can put a P or an S. It doesn't even have to be the whole word. So what do you think it is? Okay, so we've got one secondary. So mostly secondary. Okay, so if I tell you that the piece is called Valley Forge, Washington and Lafayette, winter 1777 to 1778, and it was engraved by H.B. Hall in 1857, and that he based it on a contemporary painting by Alonzo Chappelle, does that change or reinforce your response? Reinforces. Cool. Anybody change? Reinforce. Okay, cool. So, okay, don't think it's a real photograph of a specific moment. Painting would be secondary. So here's the trick with primary and secondary sources. Whether you said primary or secondary just now, you would have been correct. And I know you're probably having a wait, what moment, because that's the moment I had when I first learned this. So let me explain. If my research question asks you to understand the harsh living conditions faced by soldiers at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777, this is absolutely a secondary source. It wasn't completed until 1857. The original artist that the engraving was based on wasn't born until 1828. They weren't there, right? This is a secondary source to understand those living conditions. But if my question is to understand stipple engraving techniques used during the 1850s, this is a primary source. So, a single source, depending on the research question that we ask, can be both primary or secondary. It just depends on that research question, which leads very nicely. Of course, it plans a segue to question number 3, or to rule number 3. Define your sources in relation to the question. Molly, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say, Heather, that was the moment at which you blew my mind the first time I saw you present, because that was not the way I used to teach it in my classroom. And that I would change so many things now to go back. So.
And I come to these saying I used to be a classroom teacher and I didn't do it that way either. Like, go ahead.
I was just going to add, that's a great example of context for kids, because sometimes I think it's hard for them to understand what you mean by context, and that would illustrate it for them.
And it's a simple thing that when I was teaching, never thought of. But you talk to a historian and they're like, well, you can't call it primary or secondary until you know the research question. And you're like, like, never thought of it. So when historians seek to document an event in the past, they begin with a question. And when they examine those other interpretations from historians' historical sources, they don't define the sources until they know how it relates to the question, which again, it's crazy to think about. Like, to them, it's just so second nature. And I think in education, we've gotten so in tune with our definitions, we stop to think about kind of beyond the simple definitions. None of them are wrong, right? When I'm asking a question that makes this primary, or makes it secondary, it is because it is not in proximity to the event. That answer is correct. It's just a different way of framing it. So in the guidelines for primary source literacy, which was written by, and I'm going to give you the acronym, the American College of Research Librarians Rare Books Manuscript Section, and SAA's Guideline for Primary Source Literacy, the authors codified a general set of principles for archivists, librarians, and educators seeking to facilitate the effective use of primary sources in teaching environments. And so the guidelines really clarify the necessary skills and best practices to ensure students understand how to use primary sources. And so this quote represents their explanation of how you define a primary source. And what I love about it specifically is that it talks about it being subject to the different interpretive processes that researchers bring to their projects. This takes it out of history, right? If I'm a scientist and I go look at an older scientist's notes about my experiment, I'm looking at a primary source. It's not just history, right? And so I love that piece of disciplinary practice that's in that definition, which is why I put it in here, because I think it's important for us to think about these sources outside of just history, because anytime you have a research question, the stuff that's in immediate proximity to that question is a primary source, and the stuff that's secondary and kind of interpretive is your secondary source. So let's look about what this looks like in practice. So I think these in practice suggestions really merge with 2 and 3 because there's so much synthesis between the two. So it's really looking at like, how do we practice the fluidity and defining them, and then defining them in relation to the question, because those two things go together. So part of this is teaching students to move beyond the old new dichotomy, right? Because depending on your question, new stuff could be a primary source or old stuff could be a primary source, right? So these are good definitions, right? So the way that you add that piece of historical nuance, right, is that it's about the proximity to the subject of your research question. So whether it's old or new doesn't matter. It's, can it provide direct firsthand accounts to answer this research question? If the answer is yes, it's primary. If it's unable to observe it directly, or it's got that reliance on others, then it's secondary. And that's the key. That's the only tweak that I'm suggesting. Otherwise, your definitions that you already have and your students already know work. It's just teaching them how to define them in relation to the question. So 2 ways I would scaffold instruction on this. First, I think a relatively straightforward way to do this is to compile a stack of sources both original and interpretive, that depict, describe, or analyze a single event. So I do this with Martin Luther King's March on Washington. So I provide a couple of sources, images of King speaking, a clip from the I Have a Dream speech. We do the bus instructions for where to park. We do comments of people who were there that day. But then I also provide conversations from King's kids later, looking back at the event. And then what I do is I write 3 to 4 research questions that allow the sources to be organized as both primary and secondary. And then in class, I pose one question at a time, having the students move them. Is it primary, secondary, or irrelevant? And so based on the research question I'm asking, they have to sort them every time. And so the last research question I always ask is, how did the March on Washington influence modern marches on Washington? Because then the stuff that's primary is what they're saying about the current marches, and the secondary things is what actually happened for the March on Washington. And it suddenly shows them, wait, all these sources that I thought were primary now become secondary. So it's a really easy way to do it. And it's something you can do with anything you're teaching. You just need a couple sources and a couple research questions that can let them see that swap. The second thing I think you could do is, once they understand the basics of like, okay, I can define my sources in relation to my question, have them choose a single source and have them write one question that would make the source primary and write a second question that would make the source secondary. It's a really quick, simple activity that you can build in anywhere, but if you apply it and reinforce it over time, it's going to lead to a powerful understanding of the concept that's going to really help them internalize some of that disciplinary practice. So I've got a picture up on the screen. We're going to practice the primary versus secondary question. So this is Robert Alexander Graham's Atomic Landscape, which is a depiction of Nagasaki, Japan in 1946. He was born in 1873 and he died the year that he painted this at age 73. So he obviously was probably not on the ground at Nagasaki, right? And so what I'd like you to do is add a question to the chat that would make this a secondary source, and then a question that you think would make it primary. You don't have to do the full question. You can just do the gist of it, or you can grab the mic. Stacy, I just saw your comment. Remind me and I'll send it to you. And if you don't want to write out a full question, you can grab the mic. Just, what do you think makes this secondary, and what type of question would make this primary? If you're stumped, you can also put that in the chat box. I'm okay with it. I have some ideas I can share. I just wanted to give you a chance to think about it. Okay. Is this something he saw and recreated? Primary. Get one. Any other suggestions? Okay, secondary. Is this something he heard about and recreated a scene? Okay. Thank you, Samantha.
Can you say again the name of the painting?
Yes, it is Atomic Landscape. And the description is that it's a depiction of Nagasaki, Japan, 1946. And he died that year at 73. So in the interest of time, I'm sorry if I cut any of you off, but please do keep thinking about this. So for me, a secondary question would be, what was the lived experience of those who were in Nagasaki when the bomb was dropped? He wasn't there. He doesn't know the lived experience, right? Like, he's working off the accounts of others. But if I ask the question, how did artists respond to the devastation of Nagasaki? Or how did artists respond to the use of the A-bomb, right? This is great as a primary source because it's a very clear depiction. Like, you can see he's depicting devastation of this in the back, beautiful landscape, but up front, it's death and devastation, right? So that's a very clear response to something that had never happened before, right? Yeah, great question, Molly. So again, just think about how you might do this activity with your students and what types of sources they could pick and then write comparable questions to. It takes a second. Like, I'm not going to lie, like, even you guys had to think for a second, right? Like it's something you have to start practicing and internalizing, but once you do, it gets easier. I actually wrote a chapter for a book that's coming out, I think sometime next year. And I had to create a chart that had examples of like 10 of these. It took some time, not gonna lie. But once our students understand how to define sources in relation to the question, you can start framing your instruction in questions rather than in facts. And you can ask your students to identify what's primary, what's secondary. How could you use those to help you answer the question and find evidence? And then they can start building those compelling arguments to respond. So of course, this practice is beneficial because it's going to support disciplinary literacy. It more accurately reflects the work that historians are actually doing, but it's also helping your students develop historical thinking skills. But it's so much more, right? Like it does the disciplinary thing, but in reality, when we're teaching students that history starts with a question, we're opening the past to their agency, their inquiry, and their interpretation, which is huge, right? It moves past the boring names, dates, and facts. Okay, rule number 4. And this is hard for me to say because I did not used to believe this. Primary sources are not the gold standard of inquiry. Balance is key. So what do I mean by this? And again, I love sources, like love sources. This is a really bold statement for me. Like I used to ditch my textbook and just teach with primary sources. So in many ways, this statement is kind of like real growth for Heather. But in the past 20 years, we've worked really hard in both teaching and archives worlds to increase the use of and access to primary sources. However, I think we kind of swung the pendulum too far. And so we've kind of preferenced primary sources as the gold standard at the expense of secondary sources, which doesn't reflect disciplinary practice. Historians start with secondary sources when they're asking new questions, and they reference them throughout their research and interpretive work to ensure that they're in tune with new scholarship and they're not making interpretive mistakes. Given this, to engage in historical thinking, our students need, and I have it in all caps in my notes, they need secondary sources because they provide the vital context needed to successfully engage with sources from the past. It also helps them move beyond the notion of singular source as fact when they're checking multiple sources to verify information. Further, research studies in the past years have actually documented that our ELL students, our ESL students, and those who are either below their grade level or who struggle with reading comprehension have to have a textbook to really be able to interpret sources. So in all things, embracing balance in your classroom is key, right? So what does this look like in practice? I know I said this already, that you need to provide sourcing and context for all sources, but it really is that important. Professional historians don't get sources from an archive that have this information. They have a wealth of disciplinary knowledge, though, that they can draw from that it would be unrealistic for us to assume our students have. So by providing this, the titles, the dates, the author names, mini biographies, and then short statements to contextualize what's going on in the world, with sources, we're giving students the information they need to successfully learn and demonstrate a skill, right? It's not just about teaching the content in the source, it's teaching them how to analyze a source. So we need to give them those scaffolds. So while the context you provide for a secondary source might be different than what you provide for a primary source, you also need to do that because historians who write the secondary sources still have backgrounds and beliefs that affect how they write, the questions they ask, and they may even be responding to modern events or new information, and our students need to know that. So keep in mind here, though, context is key. Don't give them the answers. Just give them the information they need to find the answers. That's the caveat, right? They need the context, but they need to be able to think about it. So don't give them too much. Just give them enough. As far as variety, when you're creating an inquiry, it's important to balance primary and secondary sources. Without both, it can be challenging for students to contextualize or corroborate what they're reading and synthesize a response across documents. For elementaries, this might be trade paperbacks, right? It doesn't have to be the work of a historian. You can use paperbacks that they can balance against primary sources. Because again, our purpose here isn't to create professional historians. It's to teach kids disciplinary practice so that they're smarter consumers of information, period. So as far as preferencing, I mentioned on the last slide, professional historians would likely find it odd if we provided historians with only primary sources. All of the historians I work with spend as much time in the library looking at the work of other historians as they do in the archives reading what was written by individuals from the past. And so seeing archival objects as gold standard really draws an arbitrary line that I would argue most historians would probably disagree with. It's not something they do. And then finally, for evidentiary value, when we're teaching our students to define sources in relation to the question, we also need to help them learn to prioritize and select sources based on their evidentiary value or their ability to help them respond to that research question. So sources such as Charles so-and-so, white plantation owner that I mentioned earlier, he has no value at all in helping me understand the experience of an enslaved person, zero. But he's a very valuable source if I'm seeking to understand how enslavers describe the enslavement of others. And so source value also depends on the question you're asking, which is, again, kind of that mind blown moment, right? And then our last rule, number 5, teach your students to critique their textbooks as a source. When we think about students' relationships with their textbooks, I think it's safe to say, particularly in social studies, that handing them a book at the beginning of the year positions the book as the source of facts for our students. When we default to this, however, students often miss the understanding that their textbook is a non-neutral curation of the past. Textbooks, much like their authors, have perspectives, stories they privilege, stories they decide to exclude, and so forth. This is something I think we often fail to explicitly teach our students, and I did. I taught world history, and I would use the Stearns book when teaching military history and the Hunt book when teaching like social history. I never told my students why. Why didn't I? Great question. But I never told them because Hunt's a social historian. So I go to her for social history. Stearns was military history. Like, it makes sense why I did it, but I never had that conversation with my students. And 2, consider the last historical monograph you read. Historians regularly use the words may, might, could possibly, perhaps, likely, while our textbooks don't. They are certain. They know what happened. And so our textbooks also don't include footnotes, evidence of investigation, or references so that our students can find the trail they followed. And so all of these things are key features of historical disciplinary practice that would allow students to critically evaluate the author's interpretations and arguments. So in other words, our textbooks are often missing hallmarks of disciplinary practice, and it's our students' primary tool to access the past. That's a problem. Okay. So 2 things I would say, I really think we need to rethink textbooks, and I'm in no way saying we shouldn't use them. I just think we need to see them as a support for learning rather than the source of learning. And we need to move authority in our classroom to the questions we ask about the past rather than the information contained in our textbooks. I think that's the leap, right? When we treat our textbooks as a source, our students start to ask why a story is being told, who the story privileges, what power structures it might reinforce. And it encourages them to ask why the author used certain quotes, selected certain sources, where they found their facts, and how they chose to use them. All of those things are things we want our students doing. So just treat your textbooks as a source. And finally, this is kind of my rule of thumb when people ask me where I stand on textbooks. They're necessary. Blind acceptance of what they say is not, right? Ask questions. So I'm going to pause for a second. That's a lot. So where are we at about the rules? Any mind blown moments? Any ahas? Any, Heather, you are so off topic. Like, where are you at? And feel free to grab the mic. You don't have to use the chat box.
Heather, I just want to say, I think that last slide should be the new signature line for your email.
Blind acceptance is not. Yeah, no, I'm very, it's funny because I used to hate textbooks and now I understand they're necessary, but they need to be used in the way, they need to be treated as a source. Like, we need to ask questions, particularly when you come from a state where there is a state edition textbook. I grew up in Texas, which is why I keep talking about it. I can see Pierre nodding. I grew up in Texas. And so for me, it was like, I always wondered why there was a Texas edition, but I never really asked about it. I wish I had. Any other thoughts before I move on? Yes, interrogate, right? Like, okay, let's be real. When we talk about what historians do, our students probably come up with the least sexy mental image alive, right? Like they sit in libraries, they're boring. When I ask this question, it's always an old white dude lecturing. That is how my students describe historians, right? But when you pitch it as like, you're going to be a detective, you're going to discover the truth of the past, suddenly it's like, oh, this sounds fun. So I really think it's in how we pitch this to our students. Like when we tell them, like, it's your job to really interrogate and ask questions and figure out like who's telling the truth. What is the truth, right? It totally pitches it differently than boring names, dates, and facts that you're filling out on a worksheet. So, all right. So I have all 5 rules on the screen together. I want to give you a second to just kind of take them all in order. And then think about how applying these rules in your classroom increases inquiry, critical historical thinking, and disciplinary practice. What do you think?
Heather, I'm thinking about how these might impact the way a teacher designs any given, forget about designing inquiries and all that stuff, but even any single day of instruction.
Yep.
If you just think about it in that unit, like what kind of like if we're not going into these sources with a question, why are we doing it? So thinking about that. And then also just thinking about the types of sources that we're putting in front of kids. Like if we're doing, in elementary, for sure, we're often curating the sources for kids and just thinking about like why this one and why not another one, and having those conversations with kids. Like, here's why I chose this. I curated it. I'm also the person that chose it. There's a bunch of other things I could have chosen that I didn't choose. And those are things elementary students you can have conversations with them about that too. So I think that's an exciting way to think about designing instruction.
Well, and think about like your elementary students. They go to the library and look at 4 books and choose the one that's most interesting to them. They know what that is. They know what choice is. They know why it's important. They might not know the term curation, but they know choice. And when we talk to them about why we make those decisions, like, look, here are the 2 sources I debated between, and here's the one I chose, and here's why, right? Think about the civil rights movement. Why was Rosa Parks the leader of the bus boycotts when really Claudette Colvin did it first? Well, if you read the sources, they didn't want to uplift a single mother who was in her teens. That's why. And then when you think about Rosa Parks, like our textbooks describe her as old, but when you see her picture, P.S., she looks younger than I am because she was. She wasn't an old lady who was too tired to get to her seat. When we pitch her as too tired to go to her seat, you remove her agency as an activist. That's a problem. And textbooks do it. Not all of them anymore, but you can still find them. Any other thoughts?
I was looking at the word fluid or fluidity, and I think that that's really important to embrace, because I teach 8th grade history, and every hour can be different depending. I mean, you have to be fluid and embrace the questions, and not necessarily be the keeper of information and knowing what's right and what's wrong. And I think it's important for students to see that and experience, that you're a partner in the process.
And this really requires a paradigm shift in how we think about our role in the classroom, right? We're facilitators, but we're also co-learners. And I think that's key, right? Like if we're willing to embrace questions in the classroom, we don't have to be the experts anymore, because we're wanting to find out just as much as they are. And when they see us modeling those behaviors, how powerful for them to see a learner who's a lifelong learner, who's willing to say, I don't know, let's find out together. How would we find that? It's so powerful. So I'm going to move on just because of time, but remember, our goal here isn't to ensure that all of our students become professional historians, although it would be super cool if you grew the next door as Kern's Goodwin, not going to lie. But when we think about history, I always talk about cultivation. It's one of my favorite words to use. Pierre can tell you. It's one of my favorite words to use in my conference presentations, because when we're cultivating this, we're planting the seeds, right? Like it's our job to plant the seeds of historical thinking and cultivate those skills over time across the district, across the grade levels. Because the ability to encounter information and to ask questions about who created it and why is necessary to the development of an informed citizenry, something that is vital to democracy and something that should be our goal as social studies teachers, right? Like, I'm not trying to grow professional historians. I want to grow informed citizens who are going to be voting for the things that affect me, right? And so that should be our goal, is planting those seeds and giving them space to grow. So a couple steps to implement. And I'm just going to kind of run through these because I think they're pretty self-explanatory. Examine how you're already using sources in the classroom and identify where you're already doing some of these things, because I guarantee you are. You're already doing some of this. And so build on that and then determine where you need to adapt instruction. It is not about recreating the wheel. It's about finding places where you can complicate how you're teaching things. Second, start the year teaching your students about the nature and definition of sources. Huge, right? When you start with that, and you give them that foundation for strong analytical work, you'll build better historical thinking skills throughout the year. Third, be mindful of how you use those original records in your textbook. Are you using them in a balanced manner that preferences your research questions and critique over the simple transfer of information and facts? If you're not, what can you change? Okay. Fourth, partner with your peers to build inquiries around a compelling question using a variety of sources. If you partner, you don't have to do as much work, and you guys are all teaching content. And here's the thing, what you use in second grade can be the same thing you use in fourth grade, the same thing you use in sixth grade, if you modify it according to their age and what their needs are, and you change your research question. You can use the same sources once you find them. Don't forget that, because it's also, if they see that across second, fourth, and sixth grade, it's building their disciplinary understanding and nuance as well, not just like helping you. It's a win-win all around. Ask your students to respond to those inquiries using their sources as evidence, which you can then collect as formative or informative assessments to gauge their understanding of historical thinking and disciplinary practice. And then finally, don't be afraid to reach out to historians, archivists, and museum staff if you need help. We absolutely love working with teachers to improve disciplinary practice in the classroom, and we often have access to resources you don't. And if you call us, we can get them quicker than you can get them if you go online. So just something to think about. So I think I have 2 minutes left. I can't believe I finished it all. So I'm going to stop. Yes, Molly. Doing it with a partner makes such a difference. Like, I can't tell you how many times Pierre, who's the other Pierre, by the way, you say Heather Nice on your name. I sent you my link. Pierre, who's the other Heather Nice on the call. She and I work together on stuff like this all the time. And it's so much fun to be able to bounce ideas off, ask which sources are better. Sometimes we find sources that the other person didn't find. It's like, oh, this is so cool. But this relates to something I found. So it creates that collaboration that's frankly more fun, right? So any questions, any thoughts? Anything you want to talk about in our last 2 minutes? And I am gonna.
Here, and Heather, I'm gonna stop the recording so we can do questions.